Okay, so at this point, I'd like to welcome everyone to the inaugural lecture of the Literacies GIP, right? Shared research cooperation between the University of Duisburg-Essen and the University of Cincinnati, for which we are thankful for resources provided by the DAAD, the DAAD, for this particular product. I'm Professor Evan Torner, and I teach at the University of Cincinnati in the German department, as well as film and media studies. I'm delighted here to welcome Dr. Kate Pahl, who is a professor of arts and literacy at Manchester Metropolitan University. Her research is concerned with children and young people's meaning making in schools and community contexts, and she's particularly interested in co-production as a methodology that includes the everyday and the ordinary within literacy studies. A moment to describe our procedure here. Dr. Pahl will be giving a formal talk and sharing her slides. So if someone can give Dr. Pahl permission to share her slides, that would be great, to share her screen. And then she will give a 40 to 50 minute lecture. Think of your questions. If you want to use the chat to put questions for the future or conversation topics, that's fine. So do see that the chat is sort of your silent partner for all of this. And once the talk is concluded, then I will be moderating the discussion. I don't have any pre-programmed questions at this point. So it really is an open discussion. I'm not controlling the narrative or controlling this in any way. And so whatever does occur to you is of course correct and right. And the talk will be given in English. We will respond to that with Eva Gredel's talk in a week in German. So again, this is our opening talk in English, but it doesn't mean anything that we're not going to also be having talks in German for the exchange. And with all this introduction, I'd like to give the floor over to Dr. Pahl. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Evan. I have to say, it's a delightful thing at the end of the day to come to a group of academics, and not too many, to say we're going to play. And I really like that invitation. I also feel that this is a really important thing, is that communicative space where you are reaching out and working together. And I'm very happy to be here because, as my name indicates, although I'm not German, my grandfather was from Germany, and I have relatives in Germany, and I'm a real, I'd love to be involved in this project. And if there's a way, my cat is also excited to be here. If there's a way that I can support this project, which for me, what I liked about it when I read the website was this idea of exchange. And for me, one of the things that's very important in my work is also the idea of reciprocity, relationality, and kind of bringing a kind of generosity of spirit to the projects that we do. And I'm going to talk about this in my talk, and I'm going to talk specifically about this idea of living literacies and about the book that I wrote. So I am going to share my PowerPoint, and I am going to give a talk. And if at any point I'm going to quickly or I don't explain myself, I'm very apologetic that I don't speak fluent German, but I am happy to slow down, to stop. And also, if it feels like, you just want a break. I know on Zoom, some people have had days where they've been on Zoom all day. I actually had a nice day going to have my vaccine, coming home. I'm not too stressed, but I know it's quite difficult for many people on Zoom. So I'd be fine if you just wanted to take a break, but I will carry on until the end of the talk. So now I'm going to try and share my screen, which looks as if it's possible. So can you all see my screen now? Yeah? Okay, so today I'm going to talk specifically about the book that I've just written with Jennifer Rousel, but also tell you sort of take you on a journey of where I got to with this idea of living literacies. And what I'm hoping is that you can connect to it as researchers, as academics, and as people who are also living what we research. And I think what I'd like to do is open out that conversation at the end, so we actually as a group of people share that. And I'd really love to hear from everybody, because for me, this is about working in a group. And it's not about me. I know it's about me at the moment, but it's about the group that's here this afternoon. So when we looked at the idea of living literacies, and I have to say it wasn't me, it was Jennifer Rousel, one of the things we were trying to do is think about literacy as a lived practice. When you engage with anything in the world, some aspects of literacy, sorry, I've got hay fever, it's not anything worse, are more visible than others. So we talked at the beginning, you talked, Evan, about this idea of competencies, and there's a very strong discourse, and I know that from working with colleagues in other contexts in Germany, around school literacy and the particular literacies you need to actually succeed at school. But that concept of literacy isn't borne out by living and the lived experience, particularly of the groups that I was working with. When I started my career, I was looking at boys at risk of exclusion from school, and I spent time in their homes listening to their home literacy practices, and they came, many of them, from backgrounds that were originally from other countries. So one was Turkish, one was from India, and one was Caribbean and Welsh, and those complex identities shaped their literacies. But they also, they're intergenerational, their lived life shaped their literacies. So this is what I'm trying to capture here. And we came up with this idea of verbs as a way of thinking about literacy in that livedness. So in the book, we talk about seeing, disrupting, hoping, knowing, creating, and making. And I'm going to explain those in more detail. But the idea behind them is this idea, it's actually from an article by Brian Street, who was my supervisor for my doctorate. He had this idea of culture as a verb, that the verb creates the action in the making. And this is one of the things I feel about literacy, it's always being remade. So when I go into a school, which I haven't been since January 2000, and I'm going in July to the same school, we will be making together with young people. And that making together can flow into lots of directions. It can flow into film, it can flow into zines. I'm currently doing a project in zines, which are small objects which have images and words, and it can flow into different forms, but the literacy is entwined in that. What I think is that we do urgently need new ways of recognizing what literacy is, so that it can be harnessed to meet the demands of our lives. And I've just come from a meeting to talk about climate change and the literacies involved in climate change, which for me are all about understanding carbon capture and carbon sequestration. But they also mean new ways of knowing and making. Where I am in the UK, I work in Manchester, which is a very multilingual city, and that multilingual knowledge is actually really important to draw on, to reposition where learning is and where understanding is. So thinking multilingually is very much part of how I think. But central to these new ways is an expansive and nuanced understanding of what literacy could become. So I see literacy, and I write about this, as something that is in the not yet. And I did draw on the ideas of a philosopher called Ernst Bloch, who you might have heard of, who wrote about this idea of concrete utopia, the things that are to come. But in order to do that, I'd argue we need a collaborative ethnographic approach to exploring literacy with communities. So our understandings are unformed until we actually work with communities. And that's really important in the work that I do, that it's actually holding back from the academic knowledge and thinking the knowledge is built together in a community context. So that's actually very central to my thinking. So I talk about ethnography, and I trained as an ethnographer. And I suppose my understanding of ethnography comes from the context of social anthropology, which is this idea of inscribing the everyday into texts that you then write up. But what that also means is trying to see what is going on in the everyday that might be hidden, that might not be visible because in a household it's taken for granted. So it's seen as how you do things, the everyday. But that literacy is entwined with that life as it's lived. But what's good about ethnography, and then what I ended up doing, which is collaborative ethnography, is developing an approach that enables the researcher to collaboratively develop the research questions with participants. And rather than researching on people, the work that I did ended up working as a researcher with people as co-researchers. So the teams that I worked with in homes included co-research teams, including young people, who would work with me on questions about where is the literacy, what is literacy. And those co-researchers actually ended up writing with me. So I've actually got a couple of articles gone in, one article and one book chapter with one of my co-researchers, Zainab Rasool. So that ended up being inscribed into writing. And so I was very inspired by the work of Eric Lasseter and colleagues, who talked about this idea of collaborative ethnography as a co-writing practice. So they talked about in that ethnographers work with local communities to construct their texts. The approach to ethnography as a method is essentially collaborative. But what makes ethnographic writing collaborative is closely involving consultants, and in my case, this was communities, in the actual writing of the text. Now, my book, unfortunately, I can't hold up my book because it's in my office in Manchester and I haven't been to my office yet. But I think the book that we wrote was actually co-written because we felt that as academics, we didn't have the knowledge about the literacies in the community. We had to work collaboratively to do that. So going back to where I started, and some of you will know this and some of you won't, so I decided I would explain it just because I thought that would help. So I work with this idea from the New Literacy Studies of literacy practices as described by Brian Street and Shirley Bryce Heath. And they provide a description of the everyday pattern practices in everyday life. And they also talked about literacy events. So that might be a moment when I scribble in my notebook and it's something ongoing in everyday life. So the literacy event is describing literacy practices, but in time, so you can watch something emerge. So this provided for me a way of understanding the way practices work and the way events and practices develop over time and space. So I spent a lot of my time watching young people traveling between home and school, putting things in their backpacks, doodling, playing, reading, but all these different activities. And I think one of the things I wanted to do is place myself into that process. So the Living Literacies book was about saying, I was in that space, I was watching those everyday literacy practices. So one of the things, I love this quotation, it's from an edited handbook on literacy that I edited with Jennifer Rousel, saying that literacy cannot be separated from what people are doing, how they're doing it, when and what, under what conditions and with whom they're doing it. Metaphorically, there's no separation of the dancer from the dance. So what I like about this is a bit with your group, like with your group here, your group is enacting these principles of researching literacy through becoming a group. So you're almost enacting your interest to get away from those very instrumental concepts of literacy into a much more expansive concept. So you you don't separate yourself from your subject, and that's what I'm interested in. So these are some of my, as it were, conceptual ideas that I work with, but they were drawing on the research. I always worked with this idea of literacies in communities and literacies with a plural because they were diverse, are multilingual. And I think that was really important to me because the multilingualism of them often meant that some of the bits of the literacies were invisible. They might be in Arabic script, they might be in Urdu, they might be in different linguistic registers, but those literacies were still really important. I also drew from Gunter Kress this idea of the multimodality of literacy practices. They're often mixed with drawing and they're often materially situated. I work a lot in neighborhoods where people are going across time and space, not necessarily physically, but they might be going into digital television channels, using translocal literacies. And I'm thinking of Doris Warrener's work here, situated in multilingual neighborhoods that often draw on multiple modes and cultural practices. I have got a list of references at the back, so you'll get their references. I also think that when we sit in homes, particularly, literacies work in a very complex way. You might see somebody going on their phones, off their phones, they might doodle, they might do some collage. Those in-betweennesses is actually very common. And I've written in some other articles about the problem that literacy researchers have, which they want to separate these out, whereas I see them as almost in a holistic form. So this is from one of my very early encounters in a home, which was a Turkish child who's called Fatih, who was playing with his mother's prayer beads in his home. And he made the shapes of the countries he visited. So he would make, this is Turkey and also Saudi Arabia and also the UK. And those shapes were an articulation of his identity, crossing those different spaces, but they weren't actually anything written. But I still feel that was a literacy, a practice which actually embodied his ideas, and it seeped into his storying, which was oral. And that's the kind of thing, it's kind of quite ephemeral. I remember one of my colleagues saying to me, but that's nothing, Kate. And I was saying, no, that is something, it just doesn't look like a recognizable literacy. And I think that's what I'm really, really interested in. And I'm going to tell you a story. You might have heard this story, the story of the turtle and the fish. There was once a turtle that lived in a lake with a group of fish. Sorry, I can't see the bit of writing at the end, so I'm going to have to skip that bit. The turtle went for a walk on dry land. He was away for a few weeks. When he returned, he met some of the fish. The fish said to him, "Mr. Turtle, how are you? We have not seen you for a few weeks. Where have you been?" The turtle said, "I was spending time on dry land." The fish were a little puzzled, and they said, "Up on dry land, what are you talking about? What is this dry land? Is it wet?" The turtle said, "No, it's not." "Is it cool and refreshing?" "It's not." "Can you swim in it?" "No, you can't." The fish said, "It's wet." "It's not wet. It's not cool. There are no waves. You can't swim in it." And they said, "Don't tell us what it's not. Tell us what it is." "I can't," said the turtle. "I don't have the language to describe it." I'm always interested in things where the language isn't there, because actually that's what the unfoldingness of the literacy is. So I think one of the things about literacy is that also a lot of children and young people don't really notice, in the sense that literacy for them is what is to hand. It could be a story, it could be a drawing. And actually, as they gather those things together, they make their meaning. And this is from Gunter Kress's idea of the child's active transformational practice. As they move into school, they might be shaped by the kind of notion of the literacy as writing, but they are essentially drawing on what's every day, and those things are culturally formed. So this was from a home, the same home, and this was the same child talking about a bird in English and kush in Turkish, and then in the middle is the phonetic spelling of kush, and that's a kind of translingual text which also is multimodal. It has the bird and inside it, and the child identified very much as a bird at the time, and that's that kind of transmodal, translingual artifact that I'm really interested in homes. So the text combines the multimodal with the multilingual approach. And I think this is also where translanguaging as an idea is a very helpful way of thinking from the bottom up. This idea that in the everyday, languages dissolve. You're not necessarily conscious of speaking one or another if you're a multilingual child. And this expanded view of literacy is actually something we work through in the Living Literacies book. There's that notion of expanding and what happens when you have an expansive view. So this is a slide which really shows some of the projects I've been involved in, and it gives you a sense of the expanded nature of my literacy, my understanding of literacy. So on the top left is a small piece of sticker plus words. It's taken an image actually from a co-researcher And her pseudonym is Lucy, and she was documenting her home literacy practices, and she was showing to me the different aspects of her person, how she decorated them. As I'm looking at it, I'm thinking of a WhatsApp conversation, an Instagram conversation I had with the same person. She's now at university. I just read her university essay. And one of the nice things is I do keep in contact with a lot of my co-researchers. She was 10 then, and she's now, I think she must be nearly 20. So that kind of longitudinal relationship with the co-researchers that I work with is really nice, because I do know that person at the moment. On the right-hand side, we see a slide saying, we would have shown you our faces as young people. We feel we're nothing but shadows to the government. And this was a piece of film and a dance that a group of young people put together to talk about how they didn't feel listened to. And that's a kind of almost a different form of literacy. They then wrote on the top of the film. On the left-hand side is a portal which was placed in a park. It was actually a storytelling project called Portals to the Past, and the children made films about better imagined pasts. I think the World Cup was reimagined by them. There's a toddler book which was repurposed for teenagers. It had those lift the flaps about, does money make you happy or sad? And on the right-hand side is a very poignant image just before the 2016 referendum, which was fairly disastrous, I think. And it's a kind of hopeful vision of the Union Jack from the point of view of young people from Roma heritage and Pakistani heritage backgrounds about what they see to be British. So those are the kind of literacies I'm interested in. So one of the things I think about is the way in which we conceptualize literacy is often seen as connected to writing. But one of the things in those images is there was a lot of sewing. And I've actually got a colleague, Susan Jones, who's doing a project on craft literacies. But I think this idea of literacy as being differently material is something I've worked with. So this is a quote from one of my co-researchers about the textile side of our heritage comes from the women in the family, and how the family loved craft type of activities. And again, this is a lens from the community. And that was a piece of craft. It was a child's sewing, which actually you do see in early 19th century samplers, the idea of the sampler and the sewn text. So one of the things I'm interested in is, what is the relationship, and this is actually a question for everyone here, between writing and material, object and speech? How can we conceptualize that? And I have done quite a lot of work thinking about that in terms of little different kinds of multimodal, multilingual transcription practices. But also, how can we change how we do research that ties that to a politics of social change that favours less privileged communities and places? I think we're very cognizant and aware of certain kinds of disciplinary structures that are kind of linked to privilege. How can we move out of that? And for that, I mean, I've got on my desk various books that I'm teaching from. So Muddying the Waters by Nagar. So I'm waving books. I always do this at my students. I'm doing this at you. And then Knowledge is Born in the Struggle. I'm sitting here with piles of books all around me. Every so often I'll wave a book at you. So this is a very early oral piece from Shirley Bryce Heath's Ways with Words. It's a young boy, I think he was 3, called Lem. He's hearing the sound, the church bell, way far now. It's a church bell ringing, you hear it, I hear it far now. It was recorded in the Carolinas. But for me, it's a really interesting piece, a practice that was recorded and therefore stays with us. A lot of these won't have stayed, these oral practices. So one of the things I was able to do in Homes is to observe these practices. So here's me asking the sister of Lucy about a piece, a text, and she says, can you tell me about it? I did it in my big sister's bedroom. I wrote my name and I've used some glitter and I wrote some crystals, and there the text is completely surrounded by the notion of glitter. And the notion of the literacy is very embedded. And that's one of the things I'm really interested in. This is an example of nail art, where again, the nail art, this is fingernails, is very much around color and messages. But embedded in that is a small piece called Say No to Racism. And there was a lot of issues in that community, which was a Pakistani British Asian community. around racism at the time of that being written. So this is from our book, which is called Reimagining Contested Communities. And I now come on to this idea of living literacies. When we worked together as a team on our projects, we lived the literacies, and we didn't take the data. We actually sat with communities and co-analysed what we did together. And that was a very different way of doing research. It wasn't that extractive model. And one of the things we argue in this book, the Living Literacies book, which I'm now going to wave, I have got a copy of that. I would give you all a copy, but I can't. What we cannot do is turn our backs on how literacy is lived. It means doing a particular kind of engaged research, which is not on participants. And our hope is, and I suppose what we're saying is that this emergent, messy, round the edges stuff becomes the moment of the unfolding. So at the moment, I'm doing a planning session for this July session in the school, and I'm thinking about bookmaking. We're going to do bookmaking. But we know that when that's happening, when the children are making books, and they might be drawing, they might be writing, they might be filmmaking, that emergence we can't control. No, although teachers often try and control it, that lived literacy is in that moment of making. And one of the things about having a wider view of literacy and using these verbs is that it attunes you to a much broader set of things, which then make literacy look different. So if you can see literacy as a term that can be used to describe communicational practices that include oral, written, and crafted, that also takes account of an embodiment of gesture. And here I'm talking, I'm using my hands. I've got my notebook just in case anything springs to mind, including my to-do list and my book. And then we're mediating this through my laptop. And that's a very complex set of literacy practices. And we need to attune to that. And the verbs were a way of attuning to that. So one of the things that I think is really important is whose knowledge is produced and whose knowledge about literacy is produced. And I did a book with Mike Grenfell about reflexivity in literacy research. And Cheryl McLean, who was one of the authors in the book, talked about the field of literacy and language ethnographic research needs not only to understand what knowledge is produced, but who's producing it and how it's framed and presented. And it's here that the tensions around issues of identity, voice, of story, storyteller, speaker, listener, insider, outsider, and producer product bring into focus the power, the politics and ethics of our various identities and positionalities, and the structures involved in navigating the patterns and normative practices of sociocultural context. And Cheryl works particularly with a group of a particular community, which actually she's both an insider and outsider about, and she writes beautifully about that complexity. And I think that the tracing of where you are in the field is a very important part of this kind of research. So the key themes of this kind of reflexive literacy work, I'm really interested in participant-led ideas about literacy. So they produce the knowledge about what literacy is. I'm very interested in co-production, this idea of collaborative methodologies, and I've talked about collaborative ethnographic methods. And in those methods, we'd sometimes write joint field notes, we'd produce joint bits of thinking. One of the things I was lucky is that I had a significant amount of time, and I'm really pleased you've all got a grant, because our grant was for 5 years and it made so much difference, because someone was saying to me the other day, you're so lucky, because we had time to do that. And also the participant researchers were given funding to do that. So the academics and the research team were given about the same amount of money, which was about £6,000 to be in the study and to produce the study. We also spent a lot of our time in the community. We didn't do the studies in the university. We were sitting in community halls, and I'm about to go into this playground again, and it's in those spaces where the research happens. But that means that we have to work on the timescales and the space of our participants, but we have to also recognize our power and agency. And I have to think about my own relationship to that project and to that work, and think about how the affective nature of that as well. So with living literacies, we thought I'm going to talk a little bit about our our way of thinking through these verbs: seeing, disrupting, hoping, knowing, and creating. So we started by writing about seeing, mainly because this is a kind of connection. When you see, when you photograph, it was actually a project with a group of people who were homeless, and they connected with their environment through photographs, and that was their lived literacy experience. It linked them to their neighborhood. They could then tell a story, and there's where the literacy comes in, through that link with the eye. We also wrote about disrupting, and I talked about working with Zainab and having what we call a focus on agonism, which was not to agree and recognize our experiences were very different, but those differences became the project. We became activists through understanding the different spaces that we're in, but understanding the power and the issues around, particularly race, in the case of the project we were doing. I'm actually really interested in the idea of literacy as a not yet. The literacy event hasn't happened yet. It's something that is about to happen. This talk is in the not yet. And we've talked about this idea of forward thinking. The knowing chapter is about this idea of making new knowledge from family knowledge and where knowledge lies. And then we talked about creating, and we thought about this idea of what if the literacy event could be seen as a creative act. And then we talked about maker literacies, which is a particular strand of the literacy fields that we were in, which is, again, a mix of materiality, digital, and creative in a literacy practice. So the key thinking in this book, and I am writing a new book, so I'm now going to talk a bit about the new book. I'm really interested in this idea of the sites and spaces generating the thinking that we do. So when we think, like, we're in a space together, and I'm really now excited about this space. I want to come to every session from now on. I think that the sites and the spaces of the group generate the thinking in the group, and that's what we were doing in our particular projects. But the researcher is implicated in this thinking. So as a researcher, the site is itself the thinking, and theory can come in and out of that. Theory moves in and out of that. And we talked about theory as this idea of like car radios. Sometimes you hear the car radio if you're walking down the street, and sometimes it goes away. But what happens around the edges is as important as in the middle. And sometimes when I look at a transcription, I'll see stuff in the transcription that I didn't notice at the time. And I think that edginess is really important. But what we're also writing about at the moment, which is our new book, is that these things require understanding that you're going to get lost, you're going to fail. And we argue a lot in my research teams about unplanning, because actually we do plan. But when we plan, we know that we also need to let go of the plan in the field, and that's part of that balancing of a living literacies approach. It's also a very creative and hopeful and collaborative approach. So I'm writing a new book at the moment. It's slow in writing, but it's going to come out next year with Richard Stemman-Jones and Lalitha Vasudevan, Collaborative Research in Theory and Practice, The Poetics of Letting Go. So this is a list of some of the publications that I've been citing in this talk. I haven't really gone through all of them, but they're certainly behind a lot of the thinking in this talk. And here's the references that I gave you earlier. And I guess one of the things I really wanted to do with you today is kind of try out some of these ideas. Say, do they make any sense? Are they maybe too radical a view of literacy to bring it right out here? Do you think we should make it smaller? And then what's the effect of this thinking on your group and your thinking? Because I can see there's potential here to do lots of really fantastic work. And yeah, I was told to speak for 40 minutes, and I think I've just about done that. Is that right, Evan?
Yes, this is absolutely wonderful, because
Oh.
this is exactly the kind of sort of approach to the topic material that is reflected in the grant, and also in our own speaker program. So you hit the nail on the head. I'm very happy, and I'd like to just have everyone give a round of applause for the talk before we move into the discussion and workshop.
I'm so happy, and I'm not sick. All right, here's the book. I wish I could give you the book. I will, so maybe I'll send it. I feel quite guilty about not having the book to hand. Good. I'm so happy. I really enjoyed giving it. I have to say, I really like this group. I'm already keen to be in it.
Great. I'm again opening the floor for questions. If anyone has any in particular, if you want to ask your question in German, I'm happy to interpret it for Dr. Pahl. So it's up to you. It looks like I've got one from Barbara. So Barbara, you may start.
Right. Hi, Kate. Thank you very much for your talk. So I have a question about how you decide what students or kids or children you are investigating in. And then, for example, when it comes to those everyday items like that little pink wallet, do you ask the kids to show you around or to show you specific items? Or was it just, you came into that house and you saw the wallet lying there on the table? So can you talk about how you choose what items you are exploring and how you choose the students you are investigating on?
So that's such a good question, because now I can tell you more things about that little purse. So this study happened in 2011. It was a study I was asked to do about community literacy practices in one community in a town. It was actually to evaluate a literacy initiative, a community literacy initiative. And I was interested in home literacy practices, and I was working with a group of community organisers at the time in Rotherham. And one of them, who is, I still work with, Zainab Rasool, suggested that we work with, actually it was her sister's family. Now this is me being really honest. It wasn't intentional in the sense that she suggested, but I knew I was interested in, there was a settled community of British Asian families in the middle of Rotherham, and I was really interested in those families because I'd previously done a project about stories and objects in British Asian families, and I knew that those families had very interesting literacy practices, that there was an assumption that because there were no books in the household, they wouldn't have literacy, and I was interested in what was going on in those households. But then when I went into the home, I remember we was all sitting around, and I said, I think we should have a co-research plan. So I gave the girl who I actually still talk to, in fact, we talked on Instagram on Sunday, a camera, a flip camera. And I said, can you decide what's important to you? So she went away and I went away, and I came back maybe 4 weeks later. And this is a sad story, so everybody has got to be really sad for me, because what then happened was she gave me that picture and a film that went with it that she made in the home, a lovely film. And I put it on my laptop. Then the IT department at my university wiped my laptop. At that point, I was like, ah! So I went back to the home and I said, oh my goodness, that little purse thing you did, Lucy's her pseudonym, we've lost it. And then she said, oh, it's okay, because I kept it. The family had a computer. I've kept it. So I got it back, but it was a still image. So what I have got her talking about what she made, because there's a whole piece of talk about, here I have made a purse and it's got little stickers on it and it's got signs saying keep out. I have got that recording. She made a recording, and for some reason she thought it was really important. Now that's the point, it's her decision that it was important that made me want to include it, because I just saw a crafty thing, but of course it's got writing. And then I showed it to an expert in language called Catherine Snow, and she said, actually, there's a formality to the description. So I didn't go into that in this talk. But one of the things about that is it's something that could appear nothing. And it was selected by the young person and given to me, and she kept it too. And then I lost it and she still had it. So it's got a really interesting history, because in many ways, she's the owner of that piece of that purse. And I also still have a connection to her. So she sent me her essay recently, her undergraduate essay, 8 years. So that's a very long. So one of the things about working in homes is that you do have these very long relational connections, because I think ethically there's a huge issue about representation, And I am really careful to protect of course, the anonymity, but also whose story I tell and how I tell the story. So the story of the purse is actually co-authored by me and Lucy, in the sense that we co-constructed it. She came up with the purse idea and gave it to me. So I had to come and collect her data. It was her data, basically. Does that make sense? It's a really good question. I really like your question.
Thank you, Barbara. And the queue is now Svea and then Tanya.
Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed listening to you, and I think you have a wonderful approach. And so my question starts at the end of your talk, when you spoke about unplanning. And I was wondering how much, in a way, not just unplanning, but also unlearning is part of your approach and your strategy, which would go to the beginning of your talk, where you said that quite a lot of literacy is very elitist. And so in a way, we have to change the entry points that we choose in order to approach certain topics. And now I'm going in a way against that by choosing yet another very elitist point, because you, I think, used quite a lot the word craft in your description of the objects that you're dealing with. But I had the feeling that a lot of these objects and the stories they tell, and I guess also your co-productions are actually very close to strategies one finds in contemporary art. And I wonder if that is a context that is important for you to then make sense of that together, or if that would actually be counterproductive, because it once again would use a very elitist framework in order to make sense of something that already is so rich in its message in and of itself. So thank you.
This is a great question. You know what? This is absolutely what I worry about. So I work a lot with contemporary artists, and they do indeed have that practice of unplanning. And we talk about this a lot, about the practice of, I mean, it's like in the Fluxus movement and in lots of different John Cage's work, and the idea of indeterminacy. But as you say, it's quite an elite practice. And one of the struggles is to have a touchstone of that practice in the work that I do. And I'm just about, I think we're going to get an article accepted. We were on minor revisions about this idea, which we're playing with, this idea of research creation, which comes from Canada. I don't know if you know that as a concept. It's this idea that we co-research, and research creation allows for artistic process in co-produced research. And I'm kind of experimenting with that, but I don't know if it works, because I think we need a better language of description for the ways in which I am working. And yet I am drawing on, you're right, there is a whole history there from art practice. It's socially engaged arts practice that is definitely influencing what we're doing. And I just had a massive argument, not an argument in a bad way, but a discussion with an artist about the July event. How much do we plan? And I've just produced, I could show you my plan. And he said, that's too planned. But I said, I want to have a plan. But at the same time, we need to unplan, because the co-production is in the unplanning, the lack of control. And that is the hardest thing as an academic to do. And I think you've completely understood the dilemmas. And I think I'd be really keen to, that's what I'm trying to write about, but I don't feel I've got the answer. So this is all, you've kind of spotted the problem, which is arts practice is sitting there, but at the same time, we have to let go. So yeah, you're right. You've completely understood it. So thank you.
Tanya?
Thank you so much for this really great talk. I'm so happy that you're actually opening our lecture series, to be honest, because you're opening so many venues, not too many, maybe sometimes also too many, but you're making me so happy because you're complicating everything, right? Because you're already saying literacy is not what we read and what we have to learn, right? You are saying, forget all this. It's about emotions, it's about living, it's about artifacts, it's about actually being, and the whole sense of the word, and then deconstruct it. So my question now is one, being an academic, right? And this is the tricky part. We're going back and writing the books. don't we lose some of what you're describing in the act of writing and actually putting it down and actually cementing the one moment that we are actually looking for? How do we write about the affects that are actually emerging in situations you're describing, right? And when it's only, even it's a collaborative work, we actually strive to have one voice, right, when we are writing, or even 2 or 3 voices that are in dialogue, but still we are putting it down. And at the same time, academia is very, very much an institution that is standardizing all of us to learn to write in a certain manner. So my question for you is, how can we bring it back into academia? So I'm not arguing, it's more an interest for me, how can we keep it alive, what you're describing, in a very productive sense, in a cooperative sense, actually in academia?
I really struggle with this. We did write an article, which I haven't cited actually, but it's on poetry as method. And one of the things we did, this is a poem that Zainab and I put in the Living Literacies book by a young woman called Hafsa. And Hafsa says, I was yanked away from my family and friends. My petals were pulled painfully away from me. I've now been left in the dark to be stood on repeatedly. And the title is Lily. So this is about feeling very angry and stamped on. And we've put that in. And one of the ways that I've tried to represent young people's voices is partly in their poetry, which we put into the book. So the other book we wrote, we put young people's poetry in, and partly in their artwork. And one of the things we do is a lot of exhibitions and also small books that they curate. So whether it's little zines or small books. So we do have a focus on young people as producers. I have tried to get young people to co-write an article just before lockdown. We worked with a group of young people who we were co-analyzing some data, and we looked at, they were the films they'd made, and we said, we're going to write an article. And we sat around with the young people, but then COVID came. And also, to be honest, young people don't really like writing articles. I mean, it's not what they like to do. So in many ways, I think those tensions are always there. I mean, in this chapter on disrupting, Zainab and I write into each other. So we kind of talk about working together, and we have different voices. And she writes in the book as a co-author. And then we've got, that's Shaheen, one of her colleagues. So I do try and break the books up with the co-researchers' voices, but I'm constantly aware of this thing of threading the voices through with the voices of young people, but in the end we kind of colonize them. And yeah, I really struggle with that as well.
Can I follow up briefly, Evan?
Yeah.
Because I'm clearly not talking about the way we are colonizing sometimes all of us, right? Information and knowledge that is already existing. It's more the question, how can we change academia exactly to the point what you're describing, right? And not being only in one medium, or actually accepting that there are more than one voices at the same time. And the same question also is circling in my head if I'm thinking about something like classroom situations. When we are coming together from different cultures, how do we actually, or how are we able to understand where the voice is coming from in this moment? What is the affect behind it? What is the experience behind it, to actually make it livable and understandable and find a common ground, or maybe not? And these are all the questions that actually follow following your talk, right? Because most of the times we expect certain things in academia, and we all think we all agree on, we all think it's the same what we are doing. And in the end, most of the times we discover we are not doing the same and don't have the same affects, right, in the room. So thank you so much.
No, I really enjoyed it. And I mean, we do, I have got somewhere, I'll just find them. I've got, sorry, they're over there, some books by young people I could have shown you, which they've made as part of the projects. And that was always really important, to make books or films with the young people as producers, because I think the production of knowledge is in these different forms. So yeah, I really agree with you. I think we do need to change academia. And I think that was a fantastic point.
All right, I'm next. And again, if you feel free to say in your chat or use the raise hand function if you have questions or comments. I'm kind of coming at this from two different disciplines, one being German studies, the other being games and play studies. So from German studies, I do in my advanced German classes teach with a book called by SVK, which is a sort of collective school for young girls, non-white girls actually in Berlin. And so you have all these young girls of color writing their own experiences, and we go from like, you know, the students have to read 18 drawings, illustration, right? There's no text on them, and you know, and then we're talking about what is actually language here, and then we move into, you know, some other stories where people are sort of expressing as parable their own experiences of marginalization and whatnot, and the students really enjoy it. And I think an emphasis on children's literature, not just literature made for children, but also produced by contemporary kids, which is not always easy to acquire, I think is a very good means of teaching the foreign language. And so I'm going to continue to do that. Thanks to your talk. I think it's a sustainable practice. But then the other, you know, point is thinking about emergence, and I do a lot of work on adult pretend role play, live action role play, and you know, my own aesthetic system for that relies on two main criteria. One, that the role play is within sort of an acceptable vision of the emergence that's going to, you know, so I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I also know the stuff that's far out of bounds, right? And that really ought not to be there. So if I'm designing a game for a classroom or to teach a lesson, I always want to say, where's the line where they've gone out of the lesson into places that I don't want to go? And then the second, of course, is the safety of the participants, and that includes emotional safety as well. So you know, when thinking about emergence, you have to think about, okay, am I accomplishing a goal even though it's not a very concrete goal, and then am I keeping everyone safe within the parameters? And I think those two are rough enough to kind of address without anything else. But I wonder if you had any commentary specifically on that, on how do you design something that allows for that spontaneity, but also keeps things in check so that they're on topic-ish and safe.
I mean, this is something that I spend a lot of my time angsting about. So we did do a project about safe spaces for women and girls in our large project, Imagine. And we set up various spaces for, these were young British Asian girls, about 13 to 16. And the interesting thing is that in many ways, they ended up getting locked out of the youth centre, and they ended up in the park. And they actually loved being in the park because they didn't get out much. And actually being in the park was a very productive space for writing. They wrote most of their poems in the park, which is where the Lily idea came from. And one of the things that made me think about is young people don't have many young people organized spaces. And when I've worked, we've got this week where we're working with year 6, that's 11-year-olds for a whole week. And I keep wanting to plan it. This is the one in July coming up. But one of the things that the artist I'm working with is saying that young people self-organize very well. And I've watched that actually. The young people we've worked with over the years have self-organized into groups, and they've actually, the young people with the writing, they organized that a puppet play with shadow puppets. They organized a drama about not being safe from the police. And if they're actually given that opportunity, I mean, I have been in situations where the young people have, larked around by playing football and ran around the playground because they don't get to do that. But they also self-organize in a way that always surprises me. And I think it's about us trusting the young people and trusting what they have to say, how they have to say it. So I'm currently doing this project called Odd Feeling Different in the World of Education. And one of the groups was a signing group. They were actually signing rather than, because they were deaf. And they did a really interesting show about they did it all through sign language. And none of us knew what they were saying, because I didn't. I mean, some people understood sign, but I didn't. But it's that letting go, but actually trusting in their communicative practices. It's really tough, but having that ability to hold that space is, I think, something that perhaps we need to recognize that more, as that is keeping that, trusting in the process, holding a space open. One of my colleagues works in an adventure playground where there's a lot of small scale accidents, but actually adventure play is really important for children. And there's always going to be one that falls over. So that notion of play, I mean, going back to your concept of play, I think that notion of risk and play is built into this work, isn't it? It's part of the work that we do. And if you are in an adventure playground, you're going to go on the zip wire, and you're going to, so those things are inbuilt into the experiences that with young people. I don't know, did that answer your question?
Yeah, it gives me things to think about, right? Which is the playground as a space of risk, but also one that is controlled risk, right? There are things that are unspoken about, say sharp objects and other things that are not there, which will occlude certain possibilities from coming about, even though they have a great other means of injuring themselves. But
Yeah.
it won't be that severe, right? And that can apply to other emotional spheres and other aspects of design.
I think we did a project on fishing, which a group of young people went fishing, and they were really good at fishing. We weren't very good at fishing, but they were also very good at the kind of practice of fishing, which again we didn't know much about. So they led us, and quite a lot of the young people we work with are very good at things like filmmaking. They have areas of expertise where they teach us, and that's another thing of reciprocity that also it works quite well.
Svea, you're next.
So I wanted to come back to the example that you gave us with the turtle and the fish, because it reminded me, I'm reading right now John Durham Peters' The Marvelous Clouds, and he has a similar thought experiment in there about dolphins and humans and what it actually means to sense the world from the dolphin's point of view. And so I guess my question is, what are I guess scenarios that you've come up with in your own practice that allow us to leave our own, I guess, taken for granted way of sensing the world and making sense of it, and so how can we actually put ourselves into the position of others, and that can be human others, but not necessarily human, right? So do you have any scenarios that you work with in order to unsettle that position?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, I have been working, I'm just looking at some of my books, with the new materialism, and also I've just written a bit actually about trees. This is a great book by Andrea Weber, Matter and Desire and Erotic and Ecology, which is really seeing through the eyes of nature. And for the project, we don't know if we've got the project yet. We were trying to think about what would it be like if we looked through the world as trees, and we would think it's about young people in treescapes, and there's a whole thing of reforesting the urban treescapes, and we're trying to think about the different languages of trees and multilingualism in trees. And I think decentering the human and looking through the eyes of, I've got a student doing a project on writing from the position of play equipment and in the playground, and looking at play and friendship from that perspective of being a playground, and seeing how that changes the lens. So if the child is actually, the playground is the stuff and not the child. So I think those things are very generative, because what they can do is you can give agency, and I've written about this, to the objects, and the objects become, as it were, like the humans. So I've got an article called Being in the Bin, which is about these children who made the bin come alive because they were just feeling they were in the bin. So the bin takes over. So it's a much more affective world. And I think we need a new language of description, and I haven't really described that enough, for those kind of intra-active activities where children become something a bit different, and they change who they are. They become the playground, or they exchange they exchange their matter with something else in the course of play. And I think that's something that I'm really interested in exploring currently as well. Yeah, I keep reading stuff about that. I've also read this book. I keep waving books at you because I've got all these books called The Mushroom at the End of the World, which I really like. So I have all these like thoughts in my head. I don't know where they get to.
I was going to say, Mushroom at the End of the World should actually be required reading for most graduate students.
Yeah, I basically have it here as my go-to book for anything. Like if I get stuck, I just read a bit of it.
Yeah, it's an absolutely wonderful book about, transnationalism and what is the human and what is anything, right?
Yeah, it's really helpful. But yeah, I have a lot of books. I'm waving some books. Another book that I'm reading at the moment is a book called Unthought, which is really challenging. I mean, basically, I spend my life kind of reading these books, and then they help me rethink some of my work. So, it's great to have this group of people to think with, actually. It's really nice.
Marika?
Oh, hi, thank you very much. I'm gonna ask a question that I'm not sure if it's stupid at this point, but I'm wondering, what are you doing with your findings? Now you know that a purse with stickers on it is a form of literacy, and how does that translate back into maybe teaching practice, or what are you doing with that finding?
So I think, yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I have written a lot about the purse, and some teachers have come to my sessions. We are having a session with teachers quite soon in my university, because I think we need to work more with teachers. And I just applied to do, I don't think I'll get it, but I'd really like to change how teacher education happened, because I think that notion of the kind of curious, like a laboratory type way of doing research where everybody researches practice, like the children, I have done that with teachers actually, is ask the class to go away and investigate literacy practices in their community, and they have gone and been the researchers and found that out. And I think part of it is orientating teachers to children as researchers, and I have done that with teachers. They actually, by and large, they kind of quite like that because they think it sounds interesting. And I think it's that notion of finding out, and the child finding out is key. So the question I got at the beginning today was brilliant, because it was saying, did you choose the purse or the child? The child chose the purse. And of course, that is the whole point of what I was trying to say, is if children and young people are researchers, or if community members are researchers, the research produces different findings. And I think working with teachers on that notion of co-research in the classroom as a kind of lab approach or collaborative approach is a really fruitful one, so that young people can lead, not be taught, so they become the leaders of the practice of recognition of what's literacy. That's really the simple idea, but it means that you do have to reorganize classrooms, and you have to have a very different mode of knowledge production, which values multilingualism, it values drawing, it values creativity, because those things actually matter. It also values science. One of the things, the next thing I want to do is to learn about carbon sequestration and the science of climate change, so that children and young people can do it but understand it, and we can co-produce that. Because science is a very specific set of disciplines, but all of us need to understand it better. So that's one of my things in my head I want to do next. So that science literacy becomes something we young people can do for themselves.
Thank you. I have actually another one that connects to what you said. Is that, in your view, would that be a farewell to something like curriculum, or do you see the balance as being the best approach?
I've just written a piece about how I'd like to take over teacher training, and I would like to reimagine it with the big challenges of the future. One is climate change, race equality, digital, and I can't remember the other one. But I think we need to rethink what we need to know for the future. So what are the things that young people need to do in the future? They need to think about this world that they're in differently, and maybe have different architectures, practice architectures of thinking. That's what I argue. And that we need to bring together disciplines in different articulations. So what I think would be great is to start working with science in a much more early stage for young people to then influence that, but also young people who are not traditionally connected to science, so reconnecting with that. So I think different configurations of disciplinary knowledge would be really good. I mean, that's what I'm trying to think about, because I'm trying to be hopeful.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Tanya?
A short follow-up question then. Are you advocating for giving up disciplinary boundaries in actually traditional departments? I would actually support it very much.
Yes,
So
I think I am. I think I want to write a book called Undisciplined, actually, but no one's yet commissioned me to write it. But I think my problem with disciplines is that, I mean, I've been taking issue with sociolinguistics and applied linguistics for some time, because the notion that you can separate these things out doesn't work in the real world. But I'm beginning to think that what we need to do is, I'm not saying we shouldn't have carbon capture science or the science of climate change, but one of the questions we were asked when we put in this grant from the reviewers is, how can young people influence the way we think about the world in science terms? That question hasn't been asked, because there hasn't been a crossover to young people and scientists, so young people can change science. And that's what I'd like to see, is a shift in those spaces being so separated out. I think we need to bring them together. That's where I'd like to go next if I get funded.
thank you.
It's very nice to talk to you all. I'm enjoying this.
Excellent. Again, we don't want to keep extending into everyone's evenings, but I'm happy to make sure that the discussion carries on organically. If we come to a close, say now, then what I can do is at least give a plug for the German language lecture next week, which is by Dr. Eva Gretel, who's right here. And she will be talking about, the title of her talk is Digital Literacy und Corpus Literacy im digitalen Deutschunterricht am Beispiel der Wikipedia. And so again, we're talking specifically about digital competencies as then a supplement, or even the primary substance of a German lesson. And I was thinking about the ways in which we have to depart from that. There was one day when I was giving an intermediate German lesson, and there was some minor reference to the political system, and the students suddenly communicated to me that they had no idea what the different political parties in Germany were. And I thought, I'm just going to break. I don't care about my lesson objectives now. We're going to break, we're going to stop, and we're going to co-create knowledge so that we now know by the end of this lesson what the political parties are in Germany, because I think it's that way more important than, what do I say about this traffic stop or something like that. And that was a sort of moment where I think, okay, emergent content where the students say, here are our interests, and we're actually ready for fairly complex material that will help co-create. I mean, it's very powerful, but it's, as Marijke suggests, extremely disruptive to an idea of curriculum that's static. And that's monodisciplinary.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things we need to do, Brain Williams talks about finding more hard answers, that we need more hard answers, that actually we can't necessarily know how the answers are going to be. And that's because the questions are new, and that we need to join knowledges up in order to do that. And that's a really difficult thing to do. And we need to, I mean, I do spend a lot of time reading as well as going out into the playground and running around with children. And part of the reason I read broadly is that we need to create these architectures, these practice architectures of thinking, which is why Mushroom at the End of the World is really helpful.
Well, at this point, I'd like to then again thank Dr. Kate Pahl for an exciting workshop here and an excellent lecture that opens up several years of inquiry on this subject. And invite you all to return next week.
Yes.
Different time. We're going to be an hour earlier next week. So think again. 4 o'clock if you're in Germany, or 10 o'clock a.m. if you're here in the States for next week, and that'll be Ava Gradel's talk. And then on the 24th, so another week after that, Oya Hart, who's also here, will be talking to us again about a different model of literacy, especially above and beyond what we are used to in the academy. And I'm looking forward to that workshop as well. So thank you all as well for coming onto Zoom. I know how exhausting it is, and I hope everyone has a great evening and or rest of their day.
And thanks, Evan, because I felt it was a very friendly and warm atmosphere. I'm hoping I can join. I might not be able to come next week because I'm supposed to be on holiday, but I would really like to keep involved in the group because it feels like a very vibrant space you've created. And also some of the conversations are so exactly the ones I want to have, like they're exactly the kind of conversations I'm interested in. So I kind of would like to keep in touch with everybody.
That would be pleasing to everyone in the group, I believe. So,
yeah, thank you very much. And your questions were amazing. They made me think. I love those kind of questions.
Excellent. And at this point, Rolf, you are free to close out the recording.